Hey there, I'm Jonathan Acosta, joined here by our Bills analyst, Vic Carucci. This is the second part of our training camp preview series as we're taking a look at 7 more topics, some of the main storylines as we look ahead to Bills training camp at St. John Fisher that starts in just 1 week. And to start off this part of the preview, we're going to start on offense with maybe one of the names that everyone is most looking forward to seeing. Has been the case for the past couple years, but really sort of a polarizing figure on this Bills team. And Vic, that's Keon Coleman. We've seen some of the flashes of talent from him, but we're still waiting to see Keon Coleman put together a full season of the type of play that maybe we expected to see out of him when the Bills took him 33rd overall back in 2024.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that linger here, not the least of which is the pressure that was put on him by ownership back in January when Terry Pegula made pretty much the disparaging remarks that you don't often hear an owner ever make about a player. That is going to linger, that is going to carry through and not be forgotten, at least by those of us on the outside. Now, inside the team, you get the feeling that that is in the past, and it is all about the here and now with Keon Coleman. What we have to see is, once and for all, a guy who knows how to perform well in the offseason and in training camp, as he did last summer, can carry that into the season. Can he do that? Because that's been what's lacking, and it has been astounding to see how much of a drop-off Keon Coleman regular season is from Keon Coleman preseason or offseason. So that's step one. Is it about the lack of pressure, perhaps, or feeling less pressure when doing it in practices before the season, and then when things count, all of a sudden he's just unable to handle that? That's one way, not to get too deep into psychobabble with that. But the other thing that he has going for him, a big thing, is despite the comments made by Terry Pegula, there is an investment in Keon Coleman from Joe Brady especially. He's the one who wanted him on this football team in the first place when they drafted him, and he is the one who I think is taking it personally to make sure that Keon Coleman starts to flourish, starts to show the qualities that prompted Joe Brady to convince Brandon Beane, to convince the organization to draft him.
And just even in the context of training camp, it's easy to remember the excellent training camp that Keon Coleman had last year in Pittsburgh. Moving over to the defense, let's talk about Michael Hoyt, because he's a guy that didn't play all that much for the Bills last year because of injury. But in the little bit of time that we saw him on the field, man, did he look like a guy who can make an impact. You remember that Kansas City game where he looked electric before he suffered that Achilles injury. Somehow, miraculously, already by the end of minicamp, on the field doing individual drills. Vic, how does that set up Hoyt now for training camp, and what's maybe a reasonable expectation for what we see out of him in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to dive into any sort of medical discussion about him. I'm not qualified for that. But I do feel that a healthy Michael Hoyt makes a significant difference for this football team. I think of all the holdover players from the previous season, he's got the best chance to transition well to this new defensive scheme. And more than that, he is a core leader type of player. He has a contagious way about him that other players respond to well. It was making him a popular player just among the fan base in the brief time that they welcomed him to the team and then saw him on the field. I think he can make a significant difference if healthy, and that is a big if, with his performance, but also with the way he conducts himself around his teammates in practice, in the meeting room. He is, and he's got kind of a loose personality, which I think lightens things up. Not too light, but just enough to ease the tensions that are always there, the pressure that comes with the season. And watching him in the offseason, I see a guy that looks like he could be progressing to that point where he'll be all the way back. But again, from a medical standpoint, we'll see.
Obviously, one of the big talking points is this new scheme under Jim Leonard, this 3-4. Let's take a look at those 3 down linemen up front. You have Ed Oliver, who, again, coming off injury riddled season, but he was impactful last year when he was on the field. There's a new scheme for him, just like it's a new scheme for the younger players on this defense, whether it's a TJ Sanders, a Deion Walker, a Landon Jackson, a Dwayne Carter, who is a guy maybe on the roster bubble, but can he show that he's ready to make an impact this year? As we look ahead to training camp, how do you diagnose what that defensive line looks like for the Bills right now?
Yeah, the most fascinating one to me is Ed Oliver. How does he transition as an interior lineman, which he's been in the previous scheme, and a good fit that way because it called for those defensive tackles to be quicker, more explosive off the ball. That still matters in Jim Leonhard's 3-4 type defense, but that middle guy tends to be a stouter player. That is not Ed Oliver. That middle guy tends to be a consumer of blockers. And again, not Ed Oliver. So how is he utilized? And we heard a term mentioned in the offseason about him and during the OTAs that, and he talked about this too, that he can play freer, right? He's got this sense of freedom and can turn it loose. And I'm translating that to mean versatility, that he has that athleticism that doesn't pigeonhole him to one area where he could maybe, again, in certain combinations, be outside or to one side or the other, or move around a lot pre-snap. And there is a lot of movement in this defense pre-snap. It feels like that's the kind of thing Ed Oliver could flourish with. Again, the biggest overarching story about Ed Oliver is what? Staying healthy. Has not been able to do that, did not do that last year. And this is a big year for him to prove that he can not only remain available on the field, but productive.
In this Jim Leonhard new scheme, obviously one of the biggest changes is you go from having defensive ends to outside linebackers, right? So that's a change for a guy like Greg Rousseau. But the team also bringing in new pieces to fit into this scheme, like a Bradley Chubb, a big free agent signing. They spent a second-round pick on TJ Parker. That's kind of like your top three names going into this season in terms of edge rusher. Vic, what are you most focused on at that position as we look ahead to training camp?
Couple of things here. First of all, with Greg Rousseau, new position. I mean, standing up versus putting a hand in the ground. How comfortable will that be for him? Seeing him do it, the limited amount of time that players practice in the off season is one thing. Seeing him do it every day in practice and training camp through the preseason and especially in the regular season, that's a whole different thing. What is his comfort level with that? What kinds of adjustments is he making in his game to accommodate that? You know, one can say, well, standing up versus putting your hand on the ground, I mean, how big of a difference can that be? It's huge. It's huge. It affects what the player does, again, before the snap, what his takeoff is, what his move is against that offensive tackle that's looking to block him, how he attacks that, and coming up from a stance versus standing up and going in, again, requires a different way of thinking. And I would think Greg Rousseau, being the intelligent player that he is, the dedicated type of player that he is, diligent, he's sought some of those answers. He's asking those questions. And then that takes me to Bradley Chubb. Having that veteran presence there is so important, not just for Greg Rousseau, but for other younger players. But I think especially to see how Rousseau can glean from the experience of Chubb. First and foremost, the Bills want Chubb to be a contributor on the field, to be highly productive as a player. They're not paying him to just be a coach in pads, but it is part of what he does. His veteran presence matters in that way. The lessons he can teach, the tips and tricks of the trade of, being that stand-up, that edge guy from the outside. Those are the kinds of things that I think can benefit Rousseau, again, can benefit that entire really the entire front in practice and in meetings and in games.
And Vic, shifting over to the inside linebackers, it really feels like we have kind of two separate storylines really developing as we go into training camp. One is Terrell Bernard, captain of the defense, but it's not put together a season like the one that he had in 2023 where he really sort of blossomed onto the scene, right? A lot of that due to injuries with him. And then next to him, I don't know if we maybe expected a position battle coming into the offseason, But at least that's sort of the hunch that I have that we're seeing sort of play out as we go into Pittsburgh, because with Dorian Williams missing all that time in the offseason, it really gave the rookie Caleb Elam-Zor a lot of reps alongside Bernard, and you feel like maybe he might be in a position where he could even push Williams for the starting job.
Yeah, this one too is interesting. I mean, I know we've focused on some battles for positional battles at cornerback, offensive guard, but let's keep an eye on this linebacker spot. Let's start, first of all, though, with Terrell Bernard. For him, it's all about bouncing back, and it's all about getting back to the form that once made him a very steady player and a rising kind of player for the Bills. Let's see if he can get back to that guy. Health is part of that, but also adjusting to the new scheme and fitting and finding himself as a good fit to that. Is he? And we're going to see. He's certainly got the intelligence and the instincts to transform to that, but he's got to be able to do it. That's one thing. The other thing is highly motivated player that he'll be. He's got a lot to prove, and he knows it. The other thing you mentioned as far as the competition that could very well be there with Dorian Williams, who was injured during offseason workouts, spotted on crutches. What is his health status going into camp? Is he going to be able to hit the ground running in training camp? Is he a PUP candidate? We'll see. But if it's a competition, looking at Caleb Elam-Zor, the rookie, is absolutely something that will get my attention. You want to see how Elam-Zor is acquitting himself with a full roster. I know he's had a chance to work in the mandatory minicamp where veterans were there, but seeing this in camp practices where the intensity gets ramped up a little bit, a lot more actually than it was in the offseason, and then of course seeing it in preseason games is going to be very telling. He has shown a level of maturity and seriousness that we know Joe Brady loves as a coach. We know Brandon Beane admires. He could be a mature guy beyond his years, but now the real test is what he does, when the heat is on and the competition is there, and can he make a case for himself to potentially be a starter at the most, but at the very least, a guy who sees a decent amount of playing time.
Vic, I think the safety position is a fascinating one going into this as well, because you think back to last year, we were really waiting to see what Cole Bishop could give this defense. Now he feels like the thing that you feel the most sure about at that position going into this year. You have the newcomers in C.J. Gardner-Johnson and Geno Stone. And you have a guy like Damar Hamlin who's brought back, but it really feels like his position on this team is up in the air. What's your sense at this safety position as we go into training camp?
Yeah, you got to keep an eye on really the whole thing because I think there are more questions than the answers here. C.J. Gardner-Johnson, the most prominent of newcomers, how is it going to work for him? What kind of fit is he going to be? We know he is a player who you do not miss in terms of just his persona. He's a bombastic, kind of outgoing sort of guy. Does that lead to positive things? If things don't go well, how does he react to that? How does he handle that? How much of a positive force is he? I know Josh Allen talked about the energy that he has, and others have mentioned it too. And I think that's important to have that level of energy, that ingredient in the locker room. But we'll see. And then there is Cole Bishop, who is in the spot now where much more is expected of him. Again, beginning with the fact that stay healthy. That injury history behind him is not something we forget anytime soon. Geno Stone, a newcomer, Jalen Kilgore. We'll see how these people fit in terms of depth. So critical to have that. And keep this in mind. When you look at this new scheme, this Jim Leonhard scheme, and you look at how a pass rush is manufactured, it is not, generally speaking, the kind of defense that says, okay, you front four guys or you front three guys, you defensive linemen get after the quarterback, or in the sense of four, you edge rushers along with those three down linemen get after the quarterback. This involves Pretty much everybody. I mean, you're bringing people from the secondary. You're bringing people from those safety spots, from corner spots, linebackers. It's a wide variety. If you look at the Denver Broncos, I think they had 17 different players involved in getting after and generating sacks for that team last season. Think about that for a moment, and that's the defense from which Jim Leonhard came, and that's the teaching that he has had. So how much of that does he bring to this Bills defense, and how much are the safeties, and generally those are the ones that come on those blitzes because they have a little more size and that ability to not only get to the quarterback, but get the quarterback on the ground.
And Vic, I'm going to end this discussion on special teams. I know the Bills brought in a punter in Tommy Doman in the draft, but I think a lot of the focus is going to be at the kicker position because the Bills got pretty steady kicking last year out of Matt Prater. He comes in with Tyler Bass missing the whole season. Prater did an excellent job, but now Tyler Bass is back after missing that season with injury. He had his shaky moments before last season, though. What's your confidence in Bass going into this training camp, and just, I guess, how solid is the ground that he's standing on right now with this Bills team?
It's hard to think that the ground is very solid under Tyler Bass. I mean, coming back from injury, coming back from, just there's a unsteadiness or shakiness to his past, and you saw Matt Prater do a more than credible job of locking down that kicking position, making huge pressure kicks for this team. So those are big cleats to fill for Tyler Bass, and the Bills have an investment in him, so the trust is going to be there to go along with that investment. I think they want him to believe and know that the job is his and there is no threat to him. The punter position, a little bit different with Tommy Doman Jr., and then Mitch Wishnowsky. I mean, that was also a very shaky thing. And I think in terms of how the Bills proceed, there is reason to believe with their offense that punting becomes a little less of a valuable element, but you've got to have it. You still are going to have situations either in a game or in the course of a season where your punter is going to have to flip the field, is going to have to save you from yourself if you're not as productive as you want to be. I think the Bills are trusting that their offense, the offense that can produce a whole lot of points in the tune of 30 plus per game, and with Josh Allen at quarterback, and then with James Cook and the running they do from a ball control standpoint, I think in general, they're not putting the highest priority on punting, but you better have at least a solid one with a punter. Just that's a bottom line thing.
Teams that go deep in the playoffs, at least solid in all three phases of the game. We'll start to see how all three phases come together when training camp gets underway 1 week from today, July 29th at St. John Fisher. For Vic Carucci, I'm Jonathan Acosta for Channel 2 Sports.